Food is more than just what's on our plate. It's the places where it's grown, it's the people who grow it, and so much more. Join me, Janice Person, your host, on Grounded by the Farm every other week as we talk about the foods we love. For this episode of Grounded by the Farm, we're going to Miami, Oklahoma. It's spelled just like Miami, but a little different. It's in northeastern Oklahoma, where the Ozarks, you come out of that and you head into where the plains are. That's where JM Farms is located. And I learned about JM when I had a little trouble on the road last summer. And they were nice enough to, thanks to friends, come check out my car and help me figure out what was wrong. It was so nice to go back now, spend a good bit of time there. I talked to Scott Engelbrecht, and Scott talked to me about the different kinds of mushrooms they grow, some of the things they do in terms of food safety and handling, as well as how composting works, because they create their own compost. We're going to get right into it. Here's Scott from JM Farms.
Most of the U.S. growers are fresh. Many years ago, don't quote me on these dates, but let's say the early 70s, 60s, there was a lot of cannery growers that were growing for cannery. When the U.S. industry started getting pressure from foreign product, then we had to transition to fresh. They couldn't compete with us with fresh product if they had to ship it overseas.
Right.
So the vast majority of the U.S. grown product is fresh. There is some cannery, but that's a byproduct. Those are lower quality generally that doesn't meet the standards of fresh. But as a general rule, those of us in the U.S., us in particular, we do not try to grow for the cannery market. We're purely for the fresh market.
Okay. The cannery kind might be a way of avoiding some food waste or things along that line. And you guys are in grocery stores, as I understand it, right? And you serve a pretty good region of the country?
We also sell food service, which would go to restaurants, but I think we're around 25% retail, whole retail product. We go as far west as Albuquerque, New Mexico. We're as far north as Cheyenne, Wyoming. We're in Texas, Arkansas, a little bit in Missouri. So we've got a pretty good range of area that we cover with our product.
I remember when I was here this summer, there were people actually packaging some of the mushrooms that would go into sort of a shrink-wrapped container that were going straight to the market from your farm. And you do that sort of thing for restaurants and food service as well?
Right. Generally for food service, though, it would be in a bulk box. So it's either a 5-pound or a 10-pound cardboard box. The slice might be in a cardboard. We also have a plastic tub that we'll sell the slice into. But that's what will generally go to food service, which would be the restaurants. What you saw, the shrink-wrapped, either plastic or there's a cardboard till, as we call it a till, that's what you'll see in retail. Sometimes you'll see bulk, so you'll see... Like at a Whole Foods market, you may have a box of mushrooms where they're just in bulk, so you can hand pick your mushrooms. But generally speaking, the retail's in a pre-packed. It's already ready to go and weighed up and then overwrapped.
There's one kind of mushroom that is the ubiquitous fresh market mushroom that you see everywhere. It's white with a little bit of brown when you slice it.
Right.
What's that called?
Kind of a generic term is just a white button mushroom.
Okay. I thought they were button mushrooms, but I didn't want to be wrong. And
they call it a white button mushroom, even though for us that can be a little confusing because we break down in sizes, and a button is a size, so that's a very small mushroom. So we have a button, and we have a medium and a large.
So I was good playing it safe there for a minute.
You were good playing it safe, but technically it's a white button mushroom. So.
Okay, I think I saw that when I was touring the farm this year. But you grow a lot of other mushrooms too.
Yeah, we grow the cremini, which is a brown mushroom. We also grow portobello mushrooms. The cremini and the portobello mushroom are the exact same mushroom. The only difference is we manage it a little bit differently so that you have more space for the portobello to grow.
Okay.
Which by doing that, you'll pick it a little differently. You'll manage the way you set the pins, so the number of mushrooms that actually grow.
Stop it.
So you have more room. And by having more room for the mushroom to grow, it'll get much bigger before it opens. And once it opens and exposes its gills, that's when you get that portobello mushroom. Those can get up to 5-6 inches in diameter. I've seen some even bigger, but generally what we'll sell is in that 5 to 6 inch down to 4 inch portobello. And then below that, the closed veil the smaller brown mushrooms are called a cremini mushroom.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, I have to ask my family just every year for New Year's or somewhere in Christmas, we have Japanese family members. So we have to have shiitake.
Right.
Or shiitake.
Right.
Do you guys grow those?
We don't. That is on our list of things to do in the coming year.
Okay.
We're working on getting set up to do that. It is a totally different growing process than the agaricus strains, which is the scientific term for the mushrooms that we grow. So the brown mushrooms and the white button mushrooms are all agaricus.
That's a family of mushrooms kind of thing?
Correct. Shiitakes are totally different. Shiitakes are for lack of a better term, they're a wood-eating mushroom. So they like to grow on wood, typically hardwoods, versus where the agaricus mushrooms will grow on, in our case, it's a wheat straw-based compost.
Right.
So it's a different process altogether to grow those mushrooms.
You have gone so far ahead of my notes, it's frightening. But is there a family name for the ones that grow better on wood?
There probably is, but I don't know what it is.
But you haven't worked with them enough to
No,
know
I
it. That's
haven't.
all there is.
We've grown them a little bit here and there over the years, but we've always focused on the agaricus strains. But the shiitake is becoming a much more in-demand mushroom.
Yeah.
Especially now in the middle part of the state, as is generally the rule. You'll get more of the exotic type foods, and mushrooms are no different on the east and west coast. A lot of that is because there's more ethnicities and that sort of thing.
Right.
And so the middle part of the country is a little slower to adopt those.
You need to come to my neighborhood in
maybe
St. Louis.
And there are different now that is
no, I'm
when
kidding.
You say that is
ethnic
true.
markets in various, even in Oklahoma City,
Right.
when I was in college, we used to go to Asian markets.
Right.
But that's not necessarily the broad
The
scale
norm, right.
of, say, whether it's Kroger's and H-E-B or all those kind of things. So
Right.
I think that interest towards those more diverse foods is really interesting. And a company like J&M is trying to figure out,
Right.
how do we go down that path and
Right.
and stuff. That's really interesting. I had no idea you guys were considering it, but believe me, my family, we know all the mushrooms, it feels like. And I will mention on the front end, foraging mushrooms was on my list. And now you're talking about what grows on wood versus what grows in compost. So is that part of why foraging mushrooms? Because it seems that there are different kinds of mushrooms
Right.
that you would forage for
Right.
versus what's grown in a farm.
Boy, there's a lot of ways I can answer that. Probably the best way to answer it is with the agaricus strains, the white button and the cremini, the focus on them over the years through genetics, working with these different strains, these spawn companies that manufacture them, they've created a strain that's very prolific. It's very high yielding. It yields on a fairly low input relative to other mushrooms. And so I think that's more because of the industry is focused on that mushroom.
Okay.
Now the exotic, the foraging style, we can grow.
Like morel mushrooms.
Now the morel's a whole different deal. But the maitakes, hen of the woods, those grow wild, but we can also grow those commercially, but there's not as much money and there hasn't been as much research.
Not as much demand for it
Right.
and things like that. Okay.
So the foraging, I think the morels, since you mentioned that, the industry all over the world has been working for years to try to figure out how to commercially grow morel mushrooms.
I'm sure.
And it's a super challenging strain to deal with.
Okay.
It's very unique. It's very hard to control. It kind of does its own thing. There are some that have had limited success, but to my knowledge, nobody has really been successful in creating a commercially cultivated strain.
Okay.
The day may come, but my personal feeling, and this is just my personal opinion alone, is that I think that part of the demand and part of the mystique to a morel mushroom is that you have your own little secret spot and you know where they are and you're not going to tell anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
And if your secret spot is aisle B of Kroger, then it's probably not going to have as much appeal. And certainly not
because it's elusive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think with what it would cost, at least at this point, to grow morels commercially, people may not be willing to pay that price, I guess.
So, the premium may just be too much because
Right.
it's kind of finicky to grow and stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. Well,
Again, that's just my opinion, but
no.
I think there's a lot
Look,
to that.
I will tell you, I've talked to a couple of people in my life that I would consider mushroom experts. And Scott, you're on the list now. So
right.
I'm learning. That's what's cool about doing this podcast, quite frankly, is I get to learn about things that I love. And my family really love mushrooms. We just had, it's called sukiyaki for the holidays, and it's a traditional hot pot. And we joke because one of my nieces doesn't like mushrooms, and it's because she used to like them so much she would eat the ones in the yard, and that doesn't go well. Like
No.
Foraging mushrooms with knowledge of what you're foraging is very different than being a 2 or a 3-year-old and deciding to eat a mushroom while you're outside. And so hospital visits later, I would say maybe that's why she doesn't like them so much.
I can imagine.
But this farm is a pretty large size farm. You're supplying mushrooms to a large part of the Plains states, I guess is the way we'll call them. It started out as a small business.
It did. Virgil Juergensmeyer, the J and JM Farms, started here in 1979. He and his original partner here, Daryl McLean, which is the M in JM Farms, they both worked for Ralston Purina, which was a large mushroom grower. They got into the mushroom business, and they felt that they wanted to start their own business. And they wanted to do things a little differently. They looked at several places across the Midwest. Miami, Oklahoma kind of fit the bill.
Yeah.
It was kind of right in the middle part of the country. We had interstate access here to where we could get to Dallas, get to Kansas City.
Yeah.
So there was a pretty good market here, and it was underserved. So they did their research, started here in 79. Originally, the farm was designed to produce 2 million pounds per year.
That's a lot of mushrooms. It sounds like mushrooms are really small and they grow fast.
They do.
So 2 million pounds sounds like a huge amount to me. But now how many?
Now we're between 26 and 27 million pounds a year.
Jeez.
When you really think about that number, probably the most interesting part of that whole deal is every mushroom is picked by hand. You think about 26 million pounds of mushrooms on a medium mushroom, which let's say is about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches.
Yeah.
It takes about 20 of those mushrooms, 18 to 20 mushrooms to make a pound.
Wow.
So it's a lot of mushrooms to be hand-picked.
Yeah, a lot of team here. I had no idea what to expect when I was told there was a mushroom farm in the town I happened to break down in. They would see if they could help me out. When I came back to get my car from the garage and I showed up here, wow.
Not what you expected.
Yeah, and yet it felt very familiar, small townish, right? So everybody says hello in the parking lot, or at the front door. They know I'm an unusual person. They're not familiar with me, so everybody wants to be very friendly. And as we walked around, everybody seemed to know everybody but me, right? So everybody's chatting and stuff. It seems like a real family kind of organization. And you said you've been with the Juergensmeyers most of your life.
I have. I grew up in central Missouri. I worked for Virgil's. He had a couple brothers that lived in my hometown. I worked for them through high school, and then I worked for another brother through college who had a hog operation. I grew up on a farm, cattle and row crop farm, so I have an ag background. My intention was to go to veterinarian school. I was pre-vet. They convinced me to come down here and work a couple summers, and I think Virgil was looking for somebody young that he could kind of teach the business a little bit, so to speak, the growing side of it. He ended up hiring me, essentially. I graduated and moved down here. I decided that I wanted to go this route rather than vet school. Been here ever since. That was 1993, so I'm going on my 27th year was when I graduated.
And you work alongside Virgil's sons, right?
Yeah, he has 3 sons. Terry, who you met, they've got a service company, maintenance company that they started, and he manages that. And then Curtis, who's the president of JM Farms, he works over here, oversees the agricultural side of the operation. And then Pat oversees the processing side of the operation. He's the youngest son.
Yeah.
And in my role is I'm the vice president of operations, so I oversee all the ag operations over here. So everything from composting up until it's harvested and ends up being transferred over to our packing facility.
Yeah, it's so hard when you haven't grown up in agriculture like me. You think of a farm and you typically think of, either tractors or whatever it is, barns and, things like that. And not until I really got involved with agriculture did I realize how many different kind of spurs come off of it. So you have people who have to manage business. You have people who have to manage labor. You have people that have to manage equipment and sort of infrastructure. And sometimes that all happens to be one person, and sometimes as a business grows, you make it more
right.
more, and it's still a company that's a family company or a partnership or something along that line, but the number of people just continues to grow, and especially if you're good at what you're doing. So part of, I think, what has set J&M apart is that focus in on a specific region of the country, a specific food that people are interested in, and getting really good at it. Is food safety and sort of quality one of the biggest drivers for you guys, or?
Obviously, food safety is important. I can tell you just from my career, we have gone from having maybe one or two quality assurance people to now having, I don't know, I think we're probably 20 people in our quality assurance department.
Wow.
Food safety has evolved in the 26 years that I've been in this business to where now it is, we undergo 6 or so food safety audits per year, some third-party audits, some that are, customer audits. They have their own teams that come in. So, food safety is utmost. Fortunately, our industry has not had but maybe one or two significant recalls over the past 20 or 30 years. Mushrooms are very safe, and we want to keep it that way.
It's so interesting because, like people make jokes about it being fungus. Mm-hmm. How do you grow fungus in such a clean environment? I guess it's
first of all, there's several different organizations that look at which foods are generally the safest, have the fewest food safety recalls and things like that. And mushrooms generally top the list as being some of the safest. And there's a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that all of our products are grown indoors.
Right.
And once we bring that compost that the mushrooms are grown in, once it's brought inside, it goes through a pasteurization process. So when we pasteurize that, not only are we killing organisms that might compete with the mushroom or create diseases that you might get on that mushroom itself, we are also, when we pasteurize, we kill anything that might make you and me sick.
Right,
so
exactly.
The E. coli, the salmonella, the listeria, and all of those things are also killed. What's interesting is that mushroom growers years and years and years ago figured that part out before they really knew anything about food safety. So that's always been a part of mushroom growing. All mushroom farms pasteurize their compost.
Yeah.
Going back to the hand picking, one of the things that we do that helps to prevent the potential for contamination is when we hand pick, we prefer to have, and as much as we can, that mushroom's touched by one person one time. The vast majority of the mushrooms that we sell are picked and placed directly into that final container by that picker.
Wow.
The less you touch it, or the less
they're kind of fragile, right?
They
like
they
break and
they
you knock the stem off of them and the cap and all that kind of stuff.
But then there's also, when you do that, the potential for contamination.
Yeah, so hadn't thought about that.
So by us touching it as little as possible, we prefer one touch. Picker picks it, they trim the stem, they put it in the container, and then really all we'll do after that point, we'll adjust the weight depending on the container, overwrap it, and it's done. Some product we may have to handle another time, but as a general rule, the vast majority is touched one time. If it's going to be sliced
or something like that, it's different. Yeah, that's amazing. I hadn't really thought about it, and I saw how it was harvested and everything. It is interesting. You're talking about compost, and for me, compost is something like we used to do in my backyard, my grandmom's backyard, my brother's yard now. And it really has an aroma to it because we have rotting foods and stuff. And you guys have like your own composting facility. What I saw,
really big backyard.
It's a really big backyard. Yeah. And part of like using Oklahoma's wheat crop, as I understand it, right? So I went to college in Enid. It's huge grain elevators. And so the wheat straw is what you guys really use to do compost instead of everybody's coffee grounds and everybody's leftovers.
Right. So we have a very specific formula. It's a recipe, if you will, of what we make our compost from. When you make compost, when you make that recipe, you have to have a certain ratio of carbon or carbohydrates. You have to have a certain ratio of nitrogen. And then you gotta manage pH and various water.
This is where people go off with their compost at home. Right. They put one kind of thing in there all the time, and they don't understand how they need to do the balance. I say that because mine is really not a compost pile. Mine's a thing pile.
Really, all you're doing when you're making compost is you're feeding microbes.
Yeah.
There's no one microbe in there. I saw a presentation a few years back, and they were talking about how many thousands, tens of thousands of different organisms that are in there. Now, some of them are at higher populations and that sort of thing. So I won't even begin to try to explain or understand how all that works. What I do know is that we need to be as consistent as possible.
Yeah.
So we use wheat straw because it's very consistent. If
right.
you do the analysis on it, we pretty much know what we're getting. We also use...
and you have an abundant resource of it in
we
this
pull
part
it
of the
out
country.
of Kansas and Oklahoma mostly,
Yeah.
a little bit of Missouri here and there, but mostly
Yeah.
within 60 or 90 miles of the farm. We also use chicken litter. This part of the country, there's northwest Arkansas,
Yeah.
northeast Oklahoma, southwest Missouri, a lot of poultry
Yeah.
production. So we use that. Poultry manure is used for its nitrogen, but also all kinds of microbes are already in there.
Right,
So it's kind of
exactly.
inoculating that composting process. We use cottonseed meal.
Yay,
which
shouts out for cotton.
There you go. Cottonseed meal is a nitrogen source.
Yep.
It's a very dependable and predictable nitrogen source, so we use cottonseed meal. And we use gypsum. Gypsum is basically what sheetrock's made from.
Yeah.
And we use that. There's a couple things that kind of neutralizes the pH in the compost, but it also helps. I use a big word that I didn't know what it was for a long time, but it's a flocculating agent. So what that does is keeps the compost from sticking together quite so bad. So
okay.
It's very similar to if you're making bread, you'll use flour to keep it from sticking to your hands or to the table or whatever you're rolling it out on. So it's kind of what gypsum will do. So that's all in certain proportions. We have this ration that we put together, and all of that essentially is to feed those microbes, which will then take all of those different nutritional components. And if we do our jobs correctly, we add water and we add oxygen. It's not fermenting. This is a composting. It's oxygen. It's aerobic. And if we do our jobs right, then we convert all those nutrients into food that then the mushroom, and hopefully no other fungus or no other molds or anything else only that mushroom likes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how the process works.
And you already mentioned earlier, I think, you buy seed from
Spawn.
from different mushroom types, right? So the button mushroom is a different one than the portobello or anything, right?
So there are different companies out there. There are 3 major spawn companies in the U.S. that we'll buy different strains from. They all have their own proprietary strains. Yeah. And you can get, each strain has its own unique characteristics. So there are multiple strains of white mushrooms. There might be 4 or 5 different strains out there, but one may be a little more round. One may be a little more of a heavy producer, meaning higher yielding, but may not be as good a quality.
May be bigger or taller.
Some may perform better on, let's say, compost that's wheat-based versus one may do better on compost that's hay-based or whatever. Because there's different recipes depending on what part of the country you're from.
Yeah.
So we find strains that we feel, and we test strains here and there, but we'll use 1 or 2 strains that we feel do well with our system of growing, with our customers' demands for what they like. So, whether they like a rounder mushroom or whatever the quality of that mushroom might be. And then we'll plant that spawn into the compost. So the spawn, this is where I think I probably get the most questions, and I get the most people that don't understand how that works. So the planting of the mushroom, everybody thinks you plant a spore. Well, you don't plant a spore. For one, the spores are so small that they'd be floating around in the air and you have them everywhere.
Yeah.
Spores are also very unpredictable as far as when they're going to grow and how they're going to grow and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So what we buy is what's called a commercial spawn. The carrier is either grain-based or it may be compost-based. It's some sort of nutrient carrier. And then it has this mushroom mycelium.
It's like a tablet kind of thing or a nugget or whatever?
Let's say for the grain-based, it would just be a rye grain. Most is either rye or millet. Goes through a cooking process that basically sterilizes it. And then they inoculate it with this mycelium of this specific strain. And then it goes through a curing process where they'll put it in a room, let it grow. We buy that. It comes in a bag, hermetically sealed, and it's perfectly clean. We open up that bag, and it's got that mycelium growing onto that grain. We mix that grain in with the compost. What that millet does is it's a carrier, for one. It's a way to get that mycelium into the compost. It's also a temporary food source.
I was going to say energy source, food source.
So it's kind of like a yolk on a chick and an egg. That gives it some food until it can get off onto the compost and start getting its nutrition off of the compost. It's more of a grafting process, I guess. We're putting this mycelium, which
I haven't really thought of that.
Sort of like the root system, but not really. The entire organism of of fungus or mushrooms is all in that mycelium, with the exception of the mushroom that you
So
pick.
it could be considered almost like a transplant too.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So it's kind of gotten
is.
started, and now you're getting it to its place to grow.
Correct.
And as mushrooms, do you really keep them in the dark and feed us? Like
we do. It's not, mushrooms don't need light. Okay, so
Okay.
all of their food all their nutrition comes from the compost.
what do they need?
They need water.
Yeah.
Lots of water. Mushrooms are, depending on the strain, but they're 85 to 90+% water.
Okay.
As far as the nutrients, if I knew the answer to that, I would be a wealthy man right now, because I don't know.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows what mushrooms want. There's been a lot of research over the years, and there are things that we see that disappear from that compost nutrient-wise at a higher rate than others. But maybe one day they'll figure that out. But generally speaking, they need a certain level of nitrogen in the form of amino acids and things like that. They need a certain amount of carbon, but in what form,
Right.
I don't really know.
Yeah.
What we as an industry, we kind of know what compost should look like. We know generally what the nutrient analysis should look like. But as I mentioned to you before we started this, I'm still learning.
Science and art still come together, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's
it's
as much as we'd like to say this is exactly what
yeah.
you need, and if you put this many inputs in, you're going to get this many outputs out. It would be awesome if that were the case, but it also
really
be boring,
helps you, right? Like,
yeah, it does.
Like having those weird years.
Right.
Now, since it's all grown inside, you don't have to worry about variability of temperatures. Do you? I mean, and you have humidity controls.
Right.
And
yes and no. So the composting occurs outside.
Okay.
During that
makes a big
composting
difference.
process, absolutely. Wintertime versus summertime versus when we get a lot of rain like we did this year.
Yeah.
Almost twice what our normal rates of rainfall were. Snow, ice, all of those things can affect your composting in either a positive or a negative way. But the one guy in particular that runs that operation out there, if you want to know what the weather forecast is, he's your guy, because he's constantly looking at it, because all of his, not all, but most of his decisions as far as how he manages that crop out there are weather related.
Right.
So he's looking at that weather and trying to determine, is it going to rain, is it going to be cold, and making adjustments to how he manages those piles, or how much water he adds, or whether he even turns today or not.
Right.
So the weather can affect compost. To some extent, it can also affect even the mushrooms that are in the room. Yes, we are climate controlled. We do use heating and cooling, and we have some humidity control. But mushrooms also produce, in their growing process, they produce CO2. So they breathe out CO2 just like you and I do. It's not a technical term of breathing it out, but they give off CO2. When they're breaking down those carbohydrates that are in there and all those nutrients, they're giving off water vapor, they're giving off CO2. In that process, we've got to regulate that CO2 that's in that room, so we have to bring in some fresh air.
Yeah.
When we bring in fresh air...
Oh, I know you got to watch out for scaling. I learned this this summer.
and scaling, where that's the biggest issue, is in the wintertime. So this time of the year, we have to watch for scaling, because it's
just so the people who weren't lucky enough to, it's the weird imperfections, it's the marking. It does look like fish's scales on some of them, but it's from the air blowing across the mushrooms, because they like it like perfect.
Usually on a first break, so the very first mushrooms to come off of the bed, they grow at a very fast rate. They've got a lot of energy and they're growing very fast. And a little bit of that is they're more susceptible because they're kind of growing out of their skin a little bit if they're not careful, because it grows so fast. So when you're bringing in air, like wintertime air, then obviously just like your skin, your hands get dry in the wintertime, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So when we're bringing in that air to manage our CO2, we have a much drier air we've got to work with. So with that drier air, we have to be careful with our velocities of the air that we blow across that mushroom, or we'll end up with scale. Versus in the summertime, it's a different deal.
I never thought about how complicated those kind of things would be.
Right. So it's not, yes, you're indoors, but outdoor weather, the weather outside can affect.
Yeah.
And then obviously it can have a huge effect on your energy consumption, your utility bill.
Yeah.
Because we do use a lot of heating and a lot of cooling year-round, because we're dehumidifying. So we'll cool the air down to try to wring the water out of it in the summertime, and then we have to heat it back up. So we're very, very high energy consumption, relative to most other produce crops that are out there.
Yeah, it's the same for greenhouses and things along that nature. And I think in today's society, people are interested in growing indoors, and so you see more people talking about growing leafy greens inside where you want them or on the roof. A really interesting kind of challenge to us. Like, there's always benefits and drawbacks to any part of the proposition. So I appreciate your being really honest about it. I think this area must be a really strong source for employment for J&M. Like, you guys have been here for so long, and you've been able to grow the business and keep growing the business. Are most employees like you, and once they come on, they're here for a while? Or
we do have a very big faction of people that have been here 30 to 40 years. We're in our 40th year now, and we have a handful of people who have been here 40 years. In fact, I have one guy that works for me, and we have another guy here that Joe Sharbit, who's had many hats over the years. Now he oversees our transportation, but both of those guys were here from the start. The one guy that works for me, Rick McCoy is his name. He actually worked for the construction company that was building this farm. And when the job finished, he came to work for J&M Farms and been here ever since.
Wow.
So on one hand, yes, we have this core group of long-term people that have been here. But I will say labor is probably our biggest challenge going forward. You know, we employ right around 500 in total here.
Wow.
And as we've continued to grow over the years, finding that labor, agricultural labor, just like all other agriculture everywhere, is becoming more and more challenging. And so one of the things that we're having to do is try to figure out how we can adapt to the workforce. On one hand, you could sit there and say, well, you know, I did it this way 25 years ago, and by golly, these kids ought to be doing it, you know, but that's not going to help.
Yeah, so, that's not going to help you get where you need to go.
And it doesn't mean that these kids, or whatever you want to call it, are wrong, because they don't want to work the hours or the schedules that you did. It just means that they're different. And so we've had to kind of step back a little bit and try to understand what it is that motivates people, what it is that they want out of life and out of their job, and try to adapt to that. And we're continuing to do that. I'm not going to say that we figured that out, but you know, those are often daily discussions that we have of what can we do to entice young people to get into this business and stay in this business. But I think we've done a pretty good job recently, as well as the last 10 or 15 years, of appealing to that next generation of people. It's not an easy job, but what we've tried to be is flexible.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the things that seems to appeal to not only the younger generation, all generations. They want to be flexible so that if their kids or their grandkids, for instance, or they have a program at school, go do it. Go watch your kids at school, and somebody will take up the slack, or you know, we can do the job you needed to do later or whatever. So, you know, that's just examples of things that we're trying to do to still accomplish our objective, but also make the job more appealing to.
And that work-life balance, I can remember my father didn't necessarily understand why that might be important in the same way I do, or my nieces and nephews understand it, right? So it's kind of an evolution process.
Right.
One of the things I noticed when I came in is there's a cooler in the lobby of the building, and there's like bags, brown paper sacks with just the name of the kind of mushroom or the size or something. Do employees just come in and grab a bag of mushrooms before they head home for the weekend and pay for them? And
they can, absolutely. We sell mushrooms out of the farm here. We don't sell it as a retail, and the reason why we do it in a bag is we don't want to compete with customers here in town and that sort of thing. So we just sell it by the bag. We sell one of our more popular, and I don't want to get ahead of you a little bit, but we sell a lot of compost, our spent compost, we call it. So when we're finished growing the mushroom, we steam that compost off, put it in a room, steam it to basically kill off anything, or mushrooms, but anything that might be harmful to your garden or whatever.
That would be popular.
We dump that out and we sell it. So we either take it to, there's a company here close by that actually Pat Juergensmeyer started with a partner several years ago. It's now owned by another group of people, but it's a potting soil company.
Yeah.
So we take it there. We also sell to gardeners locally. They'll come and buy it by the pickup truckload.
I swear my friends in Wagner used to come and get some.
I'm sure they did, yeah. We sell, there people come from Arkansas and Tulsa, and you know, to put on their garden. But one of the other things that I'm particularly proud of is that we also do a lot of work with contractors that utilize our spent compost for EPA reclamation project. In fact, we're working.
And all of that is with something that probably was considered a byproduct. Like you need fresh compost and things. And so to be able to repurpose that in a way that gives back so much to the environment it's amazing.
And if you think about it, mushrooms, what we're doing is just a small part of what's going to happen naturally anyway. Yeah. So that wheat straw that we're using would have laid out into that field, and it would have broken down eventually. And
you break it down a little bit faster by helping with the composting.
Right. We do it faster, and we end up with a product, mushrooms.
Yeah. That idea of straw left on that. So one of the podcast episodes we already did, I talked to a guy about stale seedbed and no-till farming, and the idea that you kind of are composting on like field after field on farms by letting it be out there and it break down and start refeeding the nutrients into the soil. One of the things I want to ask you before I let you go is, when you head out of here and you pick up mushrooms, what is your family, how do you guys like to eat mushrooms?
All kinds of ways. Unfortunately, I see mushrooms all day, every day, and my wife always gets very upset with me that I never bring mushrooms home. So, or I'll forget, So, but I do prefer the brown mushrooms, the cremini and portobello. I think they're just a little stronger flavored mushroom without being super strong. The exotics, I like exotic mushrooms too. If I take some home. Or take them to family gatherings or whatever, I usually will take the cremini or portobello mushroom. We like them about any way you can eat them. If I'm doing something for friends, everybody loves fried mushrooms and stuffed mushrooms. And so, but my wife she'll just saute them and add them to whatever.
Portobello's on a grill too with a good marinade so they don't get too dry.
One of the things that is really exciting for the industry is the blend.
I have had the blended burgers in New York at the James Beard House.
There you go.
And I know the Mushroom Council, which is an organization farmers and
Curtis
all play
is
into.
On the board, actually,
Curtis is the one?
Yep.
I remember getting a chance to taste burgers that came from chefs around the country that were brought into the James Beard House to showcase sort of what they were doing. But it's a blend of mushroom and beef that allows you to have a little bit different flavor, a little different moisture.
Right.
Not necessarily better, but different.
I grew up on a beef farm. I still have cattle. So I'm very much a big proponent of beef.
I think Terry's favorite way of having it is in a béarnaise sauce over a steak.
There you go. I think we need to be very careful that we're not saying that the mushrooms are replacing beef.
Right.
If you really want to look at it, what we're creating is something, maybe a hamburger light. It's a little bit lower fat, a little lower calorie. And I believe it's something that we'll be able to sell a burger to somebody who maybe wasn't going to buy that hamburger to begin with.
Nice.
So if they look at it and say, I'd like to have a hamburger, but I'm watching my calories or I'm watching my fat or whatever that might be. Of course, nowadays, who knows what's good or bad for you? Everybody's making up something new all the time that fat's good, or it's bad for you. Now it's good for you. But but I think what this does is it creates just a different item that will sell a hamburger that wasn't going to be sold before.
Yeah.
It does give it, in my opinion, it gives
some
it a little bit.
Some people like plant-based, some people like beef-based. This is kind of middle ground.
I think they call that a flexitarian now.
Yeah.
Is what there's a new name for something every day. But I think it's something where it's truly is a win-win, where beef is going to get the benefit of people want beef. They want a hamburger.
Oh, definitely.
They want the flavor of that hamburger, but maybe they don't want quite as many calories today.
Yeah.
This is an example of where we can take mushrooms, put that mushroom, basically you grind it up.
And I had some really good flavored.
Right.
It was really good.
It's very moist.
Yeah.
But a lot of times you don't pick up the mushroom flavor. So there may be some people that say, I don't really care for mushrooms. But what you taste is the hamburger.
Yeah.
So I've had meatballs that have been 30, 40% mushrooms and you didn't know it. They tasted just like any other meatball. Sonic, actually, they've had 2, I think maybe 3 times now that they've come out with a limited time offer of their Slinger.
Yeah.
Their Slinger is, I believe, 25% mushrooms.
Oh, nice.
And it has been very well received every time they brought it out. It's a very good burger. It's a 300-calorie hamburger. It's fantastic. So those are things that I think mushrooms are becoming a little bit more mainstream in that we're doing this blend and people are learning to use mushrooms at home rather than just be a luxury thing that they'll go to a restaurant and order. So I think the future for mushrooms is very bright. I hope so anyway.
As opposed to the dark rooms they're
raised in. As opposed to the dark rooms. Perfect segue.
It sounds great. Well, I'm going to have you give me a little bit of a look around so we can grab some video. How many people are really going to have a chance to go tour a mushroom farm? Right. But thanks so much for this.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly had a great time out there. When I left the farm, I took a few bags with me. I had to. And I took them to a friend's in Wagner, Oklahoma, some college friends. And her brother Keith is a great cook, and he made some incredible cream of mushroom soup. Love for you guys to go check JM's website. So it's jmfarms.com. They have amazing recipes, so many things about handling mushrooms, what you're looking for, what you're looking at. Of course, we have the video where Scott showed me around. We looked at criminies and sort of talked about some of the composting stuff. That's all on groundedbythefarm.com. I encourage you to hit subscribe. Hope you enjoy some others. And a little different, I would love to hear your thoughts on what I could do better, what you'd like to hear on the show, what you think maybe should come next with Grounded by the Farm. You can send an email to me directly, groundedbythefarm@gmail.com. Thanks so much. And don't forget to share the news about this podcast with your friends who love food the way we do and would like to know about the people who are growing it. Thank you.